Well, hello everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and we are on McDuff Lives 2 because we have strikes on McDuff Lives 1 and McDuff Lives 3, and it's going to be that way probably for the rest of the year. So if you're not on McDuff Lives 2, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. And I hardly ever mention this, but it really does help the channel if you will hit the like button. So please act accordingly if you're on YouTube. If you're not, then welcome to everyone on Facebook and Facebook and everyone who's watching on Twitter. So we are this morning continuing our reading of Anton Chaitkin's newest book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1. And where we left off, we were introduced to the six people that our author chose as the important strategists that bring us forward from a agricultural into an industrial nation, an industrial economy. And the importance of that cannot be overstated, because if we had remained an agricultural country, then we would remain also a colony, whether in name or it doesn't matter, because our entire economy would be controlled by the banking interests that ultimately control the large agricultural areas, such as the plantations that our southern leaders were fond of and wanted to hang on to. Of course, they were suffering, as most people were, from the delusion that there are different races with different capacities and different qualities among humans. And so they had that disadvantage as well, that they did not understand that everybody is created equal, no matter what your color is. They didn't understand it. Unfortunately, that persists in many parts of the world and the country, and it's a big lie, and it's all goes back to those same financial interests. Divide and conquer, create categories, like we were talking with Professor Hamamoto last week about Madame Blavatsky and her, I think it's 7 different generations of humanity, and we being, she and us being of the latest one, are obviously the most intelligent and most capable, and therefore entitled to rule. And this attitude of being able to rule because of your genetic heritage is a huge part of the struggles that we're having in our country and in our world. And the big issue that I think is addressed in this book is, are we going to develop as a nation or not? Because if we don't, then we just become another colony, whether it's agricultural or now a service economy that just, runs the adding machines for the counting houses, for the big banks. Or are we actually trying to increase our national power, our independence, our self-sufficiency, and thereby our ability to develop in a free and individual way all of our capacities as human beings? And that is the struggle of the United States, because if you don't recognize that this is the first place where we dedicated the Constitution, to the people. We, the people, are the creators of our government, and not God, not a king or an emperor or even a parliament. We, the whole of us, all of us, we created it. You may think that's a myth. Nevertheless, that's what it says. And as long as we have that conception, then we have a duty to preserve it and protect it and defend it, because even though it was terribly flawed, it was the first and only effort to protect individual human rights in the context of a nation where our rights as people are not only recognized, but honored and protected by the courts and the law. I could spend the next hour talking about the tragedy of human slavery, but we're not there yet. And so I'm going to pull us back into the 1808, 1810 era when we left off. And these six characters are introduced. Henry Clay, who we talked about last week, whose mentor George Wythe played an important role in my own education. John Quincy Adams, of course, the son of John Adams, and a man who had incredible experiences as a young boy. He saw the smoke rise from the battle at Bunker Hill, and they had to flee their homes to go into Boston because of the British. So his son is raised as an intellectual. He becomes a diplomat at an early age and gets to go to Russia, which I think is very interesting, that he was the minister to Russia from 1809 to 1814. He was also described here in the book as the leading U.S. intelligence officer, a master of strategy and languages. The third character is Matthew Carey, the Irishman, who, as we described in the second chapter, was instrumental in the Society of United Irishmen, but came to America, and he was a publisher and a book dealer, and he had a network that provided intelligence as well. His dedication to nationalism and the rise of an American self-sufficiency, an economy that could sustain the nation into the future, is the focus of not only Anton Chaitkin's work, but a number of other writers who are trying to promote the idea of the American system. Jeffrey Steinberg comes to mind. And of course, Harley Schlanger, who we'll be talking to tomorrow, is a great promoter of the idea of the American system, which becomes the basis of Lyndon LaRouche's economic philosophy for America. Well, that's Matthew Carey. Nicholas Biddle, he was from Pennsylvania. He was a officer in the Revolutionary War, an intelligence officer in France, and an editor of the Lewis and Clark expedition records, the journey that basically provided a vision of westward progress and was very widely read. DeWitt Clinton, he is New York, son and nephew of the revolutionary leaders. Clinton excitedly studied science, saying great improvements must take place which far surpass the power of a single nation, but will proceed from their united strength. The hand of art will change the face of the universe. Interesting comment. Looking towards a worldwide vision of great improvements. He organized a commission whose plan built Manhattan out of the wilderness. He crusaded for a colossal waterway from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. And comment here, the port of Buffalo was burned by the British during the War of 1812. The Erie Canal would create Buffalo as a new urban center and connect it with Rochester and, of course, then to the west. And the last one is Jonathan Gardner Swift, who is a military officer and who is the heart of what was called the Military Philosophical Society, which our author describes as a strategy forum for economic transformation. These are the engineers, the Corps of Engineers that will be very, very important as we read into the next few chapters. I am not going to read all of the book, and so I will pass over most of the material concerning the War of 1812, but just to read a little bit here from page 216, because I think this is key to the transformation that came about as a result of the war. Now, you remember that if you've been with me for a few years, that one of my favorite places is Fort Washington, Maryland, where I grew up. And you can go up to that old fort and you can see where the British sailed up the Potomac, uh, where they passed in front of the little fort, which was really quite just a small battery at that point, manned by 50 people, 50 Americans. And that was part of the British invasion of 1814, in which the city of Washington was burned. Now, that whole story is very important, but let's pass through that and pick up after the burning of Washington here on page 216, burned by the British. The old order is burned down. Madison appointed John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, and two others to negotiate peace with the British. As the talks began in Ghent, Belgium, Britain pushed ahead plans to invade the U.S. from the east, the north, and the south. On August 24th, 1814, British troops invaded Maryland and Washington, D.C. They burned the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings. A week later, British Army forces drove down from Canada into New York State. British troops would land in Louisiana that December. The torching of Washington was the political turning point. In September, stumbling President Madison appointed Secretary of State Monroe to be concurrently Secretary of War and the virtual Commander-in-Chief. In October, Madison appointed Matthew Carey's political partner, Alexander J. Dallas, as U.S. Treasury Secretary. In November, Matthew Carey published his book, The Olive Branch, or Faults on Both Sides, Federal and Democratic, a serious appeal on the necessity of mutual forgiveness and harmony to save our common country from ruin. Well, boy, I should write a book by that name, right? I mean, all my liberal friends, all my conservative friends, all of my friends that hardly speak to me anymore, I want you to come back. I want to come back to you. I want us to reunite. Um, the necessity of mutual forgiveness and harmony, because if we let them divide us, and they are doing it, it's not just us, we're going to lose everything. Save our common country from ruin. Exactly. Okay, so November of 1814, that is published. Carey's sensational bestseller charged that the Democratic Party had worked from the time of the Constitutional Convention to weaken the federal government, endangering the existence of national government, and that it opposed the creation of even a small navy, partly from a sordid and contemptible spirit of economy, quote unquote, a base spirit of courting popularity by husbanding the public money, even on occasions when liberality is true economy, unquote. Of course, the meanings of the words have shifted a little bit since then, but you understand what he's saying by liberality, meaning spending money. That means buying ships and creating a navy, because that is the true economy. In other words, if you don't do it, you'll lose everything. Carey chastised the Jeffersonians for having let the charter of the Bank of the United States lapse in 1811, ruining the U.S. credit and throwing the government into bankruptcy. So that's a turning point. And following that, we have the Monroe presidency. And it's then that things start getting moving as far as economic progress along the lines of industrialization. Some brief notes on the War of 1812 from page 277. Thousands of U.S. sailors were kidnapped, that is, impressed, into the British Navy. The British sponsored the celebrated Shawnee leader Tecumseh's Indian Confederacy as a buffer state against U.S. westward expansion. He died in Canada as a British general. Isn't that sad? I mean, I have an inner love of the spirit of Tecumseh, right? I mean, here this is the famous man, Native American, who uh, was instrumental in trying to bring his people into American culture at a time when Americans were just unwilling to accept. And he taught his people how to live in villages, how to grow like the English did, and they created a an alphabet and a language. But the sad story is that the Americans of that time were not able to see these people as fellow humans, and thereby drove them away and into the arms of the British, unfortunately. So Tecumseh, the great Indian leader, the last hope really of any of the major Indian tribes on this side of the Mississippi, was defeated. He died in Canada as a British general, but the arms, of course, that he had for the Battle of Tippecanoe did in fact come from the British. So we have to concede the point that, yeah, unfortunately, he was on the wrong side. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's 1813 victory on Lake Erie closed the British terror route from Canada into the Midwest. Yeah. British troops burning Washington in 1814. It doomed the old political order. All right, I'm going forward now to page 297 in the chapter called Liftoff, the John Quincy Adams Presidency. 5 major candidates initially stood for president in 1824. The Federalist Party had died away, and all 5 candidates were members of the Democratic Republican Party. That's the hyphenated name, founded by Jefferson, but in recent years the vehicle for revival of Hamilton's program. Excuse me. Remember, we talked about that last time about how it was a Jeffersonian party, but through Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, it now becomes the party of progress, the revival of Hamilton's program. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun were committed nationalists. General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, the Battle of New Orleans hero who had become a U.S. Senator in 1823, presented himself as a nationalist. Treasury Secretary William H. Crawford favored the anti-national doctrines of the Richmond Junto. He was sponsored for president by Martin Van Buren, but was cautious in public statements in an era of broad support for nationalist objectives. Notice by nationalist, he means anti-plantation, anti-Richmond, Virginia, junto. Henry Clay would have been a brilliant president. His forthright advocacy of the American system clarified the nation's authentic goals for a century of progress. It was America's great loss that he was never elected. John Quincy Adams shared Clay's passion for industrial, scientific, and cultural progress, but both boldly opposed imperialism. Adams was less outspoken on the tariff, though he was known to be a protectionist. He could not stress that issue without fear of losing support in New England. where importing merchants held great power. But Adams's particular fitness for the presidency can be grasped by understanding a point of difference with Clay in foreign policy. Adams's unique insight on this matter holds a lesson of urgent importance for America and the world in the present era. So our author Anton Chaitkin puts in bold and italicized letters. So Clay called for the United States to recognize the legitimacy of any rebel regime in South America whose leaders had declared their country independent from the Spanish Empire. Secretary of State Adams counseled President Monroe to postpone such recognition until the government showed that it actually held and exercised power. He insisted on the same principle regarding freedom struggles within Europe, in Greece, and elsewhere. In a speech July 4th, 1821, defending the world historic importance of the American Republic from British and Anglophile criticism, Adams specified this non-interventionism and respect for national sovereignty, again in bold and italicized letters. Now, here's Adams' quote. America, with the same voice which spoke herself into existence as a nation, proclaimed to mankind the inextinguishable rights of human nature and the only lawful foundation of government. America, in the Assembly of Nations, since her admission among them, has invariably, though often fruitlessly, held forth to them the hand of honest friendship, of equal freedom, of generous reciprocity. She has uniformly spoken among them, though often to heedless and often to disdainful ears, the language of equal liberty, equal justice, and equal rights. She has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations, while asserting and maintaining her own. She has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings, as to the last vital drop that visits the heart. She has seen that probably for centuries to come, all the contests of the academia, the European world, I'm sorry, there's a word here, all the contests of that akladama, which I guess is an old word we don't use anymore. It's defined in a footnote, a place of blood and slaughter, referring to the burial ground for foreigners established on land bought with a bribe Judas got for betraying Jesus, money he gave back before hanging himself. That's the footnote. All right. She has seen that probably for centuries to come, all the contests of that akladama, the European world, will be contests between inveterate power and emerging right. Whatever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting under the banners that her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all of the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brows would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominance and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would be no longer the ruler of her own spirit. Sorry about that light flashing there. There goes Toto. All right, so let's break this down a little bit. America with the same voice which spoke herself into existence as a nation. Can you speak yourself into existence? Well, we the people, we did that. That's what we say. That's our commitment that we have done that because we are the ultimate sovereign. America has always held forth the hand of friendship, of equal freedom, of generous reciprocity. Okay? Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers. Okay, so we will support with our heart the efforts of other peoples to achieve freedom. But the key sentence, the John Quincy Adams quote of all quotes, is this: but she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She well knows that by once enlisting under banners other than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all wars of interest and intrigue, individual avarice, envy, ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. What could be clearer than John Quincy Adams' warning? And what could also be clearer than the violation of that principle in the 20th century? You know, let's begin with Teddy Roosevelt, if you want. Let's begin with, uh, the westward expansion into the Pacific with Hawaii and the Philippines. Let's start there. Fine. That was a violation of John Quincy Adams' principle. But look what we're doing now. We are violating it in every possible respect. We are saying that we want to promote this thing called democracy against the will of the people wherever they are. And then when we win the war, we impose a dictator that will control those same people that we promised the democracy to in order to make sure that they can remain subservient to the economy of the banks, the big banks, the same economy that the British Empire was in 1808. I love this last sentence in this quote too. She being us, America, she might become the dictatress of the world. She would be no longer the ruler of her own spirit. Isn't that great? What's the American spirit? Do we still have it? You know? Well, John F. Kennedy, He had it. John F. Kennedy celebrated John Quincy Adams in his 1956 book, Profiles in Courage. Adams's voice has haunted us since Kennedy's murder. By going, quote, in search of monsters to destroy, unquote, in recent foreign wars, America is no longer the ruler of her own spirit. That spirit means the right of a people to have true independence, including freedom from an imperial trade and financial system that keeps them in poverty, whether from the old British Empire or from the current neoliberal globalist system based on Anglo-Dutch, Wall Street, and offshore, quote, offshore, unquote, financiers. When Boston critics assailed Adams's 1821 speech as in poor taste, he responded with a direct attack on America's only real enemy, imperialism. He wrote that his speech had shown, quote, from the moral and physical nature of man that colonial establishments cannot fulfill the great objects of government in the just purpose of civil society. Colonies don't do it. You can't, you cannot survive with your spirit intact in a colonial atmosphere. That's what he's saying. This was a, quote, new but demonstrated axiom that bears upon, quote, the future improvement of the human character. This fundamental axiom of American policy, he wrote, justifies, quote, our struggle for independence, not merely because of the oppression which provoked our fathers to revolt, but because that oppression was, quote, proof of the viciousness of the system from which the oppression resulted. Now, here's another quote from John Quincy Adams, which I will try to read correctly. It looks forward prospectively to the downfall of the British Empire in India as an event which must necessarily ensue at no very distant period of time. Wow, that's Adams writing in 1821. Well, it's a long time, to 1948. But nevertheless, his vision is that, yeah, the Indians are not going to allow the British Empire to dominate them forever. Interesting. More of that same quote. It anticipates a great question in the national policy of this union, which may be nearer at hand than most of our countrymen are aware of, whether we too shall annex to our federal government a great system of colonial establishments. It proves that such establishments are incompatible with the essential character of our political institutions. It leads to the conclusion that great colonial establishments are but mighty engines of wrong, and that in the progress of social improvement, it will be the duty of the human family to abolish them, as they are now endeavoring to abolish the slave trade. Abolish colonies as we abolish the slave trade. World Bank wouldn't want to hear that, you know. Adams was stating America's founding principle of equal relations among sovereign nations, respect, quote, for the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own, unquote, in the face of imperial bullying and of abstaining from interference in the concerns of others. George Washington had fought for this principle in Revolutionary War battles and in the formation of the federal government under the Constitution. Washington had put it into action as president with Hamilton's nationalist economic development policy. He had insisted on American neutrality regarding Europe's wars, with young John Quincy Adams as one of his ambassadors. In his farewell address, he had warned against anti-national factions and the danger of over-attachment or hostility to any other nations. Over-attachment or hostility. This was indeed the founding principle of modern Western civilization, the 15th century Renaissance ideal of self-government, and Europe's salvation from catastrophic religious wars in the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, the agreement that each nation must respect the other's sovereignty for their mutual advantage. Successful economic development strategy depends upon this concept of a community of sovereign nations, the policy outlook later developed by Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy. Honest American patriots have sometimes soberly assessed and condemned certain foreign regimes and ideologies, as for example in the 20th century regarding communism. But the fundamental interest of the United States is in its own national progress. No person who is primarily motivated or driven by hostility to any foreigners is competent to lead his own country or to understand what it ought to do. Wow. If your primary motivation is to control someplace else, then you're not qualified. You're not competent to lead your own country or to understand what it ought to do. Such persons will be mere dupes of those who use the division of mankind for strategic evil. Anton Chaitkin. What a sentence. The 1824 presidential race came down to 4 candidates after Calhoun withdrew. His own state, South Carolina, had snubbed him as a nationalist, and Democratic Republican Party leaders in Pennsylvania swung away from the strong support for Calhoun to back the military hero, Jackson. Calhoun was put on the ticket for vice president with both Adams and Jackson. The election resulted in no candidate getting a majority. As the Constitution prescribed, the House of Representatives was mandated to make the final choice between the top 3 electoral vote getters, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. General Lafayette, then appearing before adoring crowds, made no declaration of support for any candidate, but Lafayette was closely associated with the American nationalist leadership, whose actions are the principal subject of this section of our book. Lafayette made plain his special affinity with John Quincy Adams, who, quote, hardly left Lafayette's side through the celebrations in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. Adams's toasts and speeches honoring Lafayette were widely noted in the press, which, even though it opposed his election as president, could not fault his enthusiasm in welcoming the nation's guest. Lafayette was in Washington while Congress considered its choice for the presidency. At a congressional reception for Lafayette on January 1st, 1825, Clay and Adams were seated together and arranged to confer on campaign strategy. They met January 9th, and Clay agreed to move his supporters behind Adams. Congress elected Adams on February the 9th. 2 days after the congressional vote, Adams asked Clay to be his Secretary of State. Their political views were by this time entirely in harmony, Monroe and Adams having already proceeded to the recognition of independent nations in South America. For Treasury Secretary, Adams chose the strong Philadelphia nationalist Richard Rush, a friend of National Bank President Biddle since their childhood. Rush would be on the ticket for vice president when Adams ran for re-election in 1828. For Army Secretary, Adams chose Virginian Philip Barbour, who had recently shifted away from adherence to the Richmond anti-national dogmas. Barbour would organize the spectacular success of the Army Engineers. The Nationalists saw to the election of Representative John W. Taylor of New York as Speaker of the House, an anti-slavery activist allied to Clinton, Adams, and Clay. Taylor would help the new administration with the organization of forces in Congress. The Andrew Jackson campaign denounced the election as a corrupt bargain wherein Clay had sold out his rival Adams in exchange for the office of Secretary of State. But Martin Van Buren at first held off from launching an attack. He had suffered a double defeat with the elections of Governor Clinton and President Adams, and the country was excited at the prospects for prosperity in a new era. In his modest inaugural address on March the 4th, 1825, Adams said he would, quote, proceed in the great system of internal improvements within the limits of the constitutional power of the Union, unquote. He would follow in Monroe's footsteps and hoped that friendly, patient, and persevering deliberation would remove objections to government action for infrastructure development. The full intentions of the Adams presidency in domestic and foreign policy were publicly presented 9 months after the inauguration in his first annual message to Congress, December 6, 1825. Quote, "The great object of civil government is the improvement of the conditions of those over whom it is established. Roads and canals, by multiplying and facilitating the communications and intercourse between distant regions and multitudes of men, are among the most important means of improvement." He quotes from the Constitution concerning the extensive powers that it gives to Congress to, quote, "lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, to fix the standard of weights and measures, to establish post offices and post roads, declare war, and raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory of the United States, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying these powers into execution." He challenges the Congress. Quote, "If these powers and others enumerated in the Constitution may effectually, I'm going to start over. If these powers and others enumerated in the Constitution may be effectually brought into action by laws promoting the improvement of agriculture, commerce, and manufactures, the cultivation and encouragement of the mechanic and the elegant arts, the advancement of literature, and the progress of the sciences, ornamental and profound, to refrain from exercising them for the benefit of the people themselves would be to hide in the earth the talent committed to our charge, would be treachery to the most sacred of trusts." He then summons them to action with the same combination of moral purpose and national interest that President John F. Kennedy would use in his call for an American mission to the moon. Adams says that God gave us power on the condition that we use it for the benefit of our fellow men. Quote, "The spirit of improvement is abroad upon the earth. It stimulates the hearts and sharpens the faculties, not of our fellow citizens alone, but of the nations of Europe and of their rulers. While dwelling with pleasing satisfaction upon the superior excellence of our political institutions, let us not be unmindful that liberty is power, that the nation blessed with the largest portion of liberty must, in proportion to its numbers, be the most powerful nation upon earth, and that the tenure of power by man is, in the moral purposes of his Creator, upon condition that it shall be exercised to the ends of beneficence, to improve the condition of himself and his fellow men. While foreign nations less blessed with freedom than ourselves are advancing with gigantic strides in the career of public improvement, we were to slumber in indolence. Were we to slumber in indolence or fold up our arms and proclaim to the world that we are palsied by the will of our constituents? Would it not be to cast away the bounties of Providence and doom ourselves to perpetual inferiority?" Unquote. With this rationale, the Adams administration, in cooperation with the Bank of the United States, the Army, state and local governments, and progressive private companies, would promote vast new canal networks and would begin the railroads of the United States. In the same speech, Adams suggests federal action to establish a national university with an astronomical observatory and to fully explore and survey the interior of the continent. Adams also announces that he has accepted an invitation from the republics of Colombia, Mexico, and Central America for the United States to send a delegation to a Congress of American nations to take place in the early summer of 1826 in Panama, then a department within Colombia. These declared presidential intentions, fully reviving the nationalism of the founding George Washington's administration, ignited a frenzy among the anti-national slaveholders. Their northern partner, Martin Van Buren, promptly introduced into the Senate a constitutional amendment limiting the power of the federal government to make roads and canals. This proposal found little support, but the opposition to Adams's whole announced policy soon focused on one point: trying to block U.S. participation in the Panama Congress. A protracted debate In protracted debate on this topic, Representative John Randolph, perhaps fueled by liquor, attacked President Adams and Secretary of State Clay as swindlers and prostitutes. Clay challenged them to a duel and fired a shot that only tore Randolph's coat. It was during this debate that Van Buren decided upon a new political grand strategy. He began to coach and organize the forces loyal to Andrew Jackson in their opposition to Adams. Van Buren now took up the project that Aaron Burr had originally proposed to use Andrew Jackson as the popular figurehead of an entirely new political party based on the alliance of Van Buren's New York political machine with the Richmond junto and other Southerners of the most extreme anti-national tendency. John Quincy Adams became, from then on, the object of the most brutal, unprincipled attacks. This was a conscious replication of the slander and vitriol directed against Alexander Hamilton, who had ultimately foiled the action program of the Washington administration, which had ultimately foiled the action program of the Washington administration. Jackson's rise to the presidency after Adams's single 4-year term would begin the era of slaveholder domination of the government, culminating in Southern secession and the Civil War. Yet, under the Adams presidency, America was successfully guided into an immense transformation of its national life, the first of two phases of its industrial revolution. In this and the succeeding chapter, we will examine four principal elements of this triumphant change: the creation of the country's canals, railroads, the coal industry, and modern iron production. Well, I think that's about enough for this morning. The fight there in 1820s between Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams, basically a three-way dispute, results in the presidency of only one term of John Quincy Adams. But during that term, the American system is put into play. And we will read more about that in terms of the creation of the Erie Canal, the B&O Railroad, and a number of other very important projects when we return to the book next Monday. But for now, I think I will let it be and wish you all a happy day. I see our chat room. I'll go through it for just a minute. Corky's off to the dentist. Oh, I know what that's like. So my sympathy. I hope everything comes out all right, as they say. All right. And good morning, everyone. Yes, the Iroquois Nation influence, absolutely. Ah. Canals and railroads protected and continue to protect the nation. Yes, that's what we think. That's what I think. We haven't burnt down London yet. No, we did burn down. I think it was called Hamilton, Ontario, but that was not the big deal it's been made out to be. It was no reason for them to burn Washington, for goodness sakes. Um, Putin's called out America's neocolonialism and outward Satanism in recent speech before signing yeah, he did. And it's interesting, isn't it? How is that going to play out? Is he going to get any traction from that among Americans? Are we going to say, yeah, you're right, this Satanism is real. Neocolonialism is real. That's what we were just talking about with that John Quincy Adams. Don't go out seeking monsters to slay. you know well, if Putin is a monster, it looks like we've decided to go out and slay that monster, doesn't it? Not what we're supposed to be about. That's not who we are. That's not the American way. We have so much work to do at home. We have so much poverty. We have so much devastation of our environment. It's not just the infrastructure, it's the rivers themselves. It's the air, it's everything that the founding fathers, John Quincy Adams, worked for is now being subsumed under this crazy new world order thing, which is just another set of clothes for the empire of nothingness, the empire of counting your money until you die. Not our spirit. America, revive your spirit. Friends, come back. Let us preserve this country that we both depend upon, that we all depend upon. All right, next Monday we will continue with Who We Are, Anton Chaitkin. Um, I will see you tomorrow with the great Harley Schlanger, and we can certainly talk to him about the American system, Matthew Carey, Henry Carey, and all of his incredible breadth of knowledge. Looking forward to that very much. And by the way, Mark Kulak has really been on fire lately. Make sure and follow him at Housatonic Live on YouTube, HousatonicITS.com. And we'll be seeing him along with David Cranmer Underdown for a Wednesday night trio this week. Always a popular show. I hope you can join us for that. Don't forget, we've now got podcasts. My wife, Marcia, is now working on our third one. We have two that you can find just by Googling McDuff Lives podcast. And we're on Spotify and Google Play and a number of others. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for everyone that supports me at Patreon. And we will see you tomorrow.